time I've run this particular session for the third degree. So I have a feeling it's going to be a little bit long. So, buckle up and prepare. But what I'm trying to do tonight is to share some of the practical considerations that we need or that we need to take into account when we're looking at how to include graphics. And I'm just going to visual communication content is the kind of the technical term I'm going to give it, but include that into our dissertation. So there's a lot that I can talk about. There's a lot I will be talking about, but there's also going to be some practical things that I'm going to share on social media in the coming few days, including some other slides and so forth, that will add a little bit of extra to our discussion tonight. Purposely tonight, I really want to talk about what we have to consider from a communication standpoint, i.e., as researchers, getting our ideas through graphics across to our reader, which is going to be, our supervisor, our panel examiners, maybe a few other people as well, right? But how we get those across in the best possible way. And it's not about how do I go and design a pie chart or silly things like that. We can get that online and we can learn those skills elsewhere. But it's the considerations about when we're choosing certain things, how we work with proportions, how we make sure that our graphic content represents accurately what we want to say. If you saw the post I put up on LinkedIn before, it was really a bit of a joke post with a couple of sort of visuals about presenting data. And it really sort of just reinforced a message that I wanted to get across. Whatever graphic we choose, whatever way we choose to visually present our data, whether it be a table, a figure, a map, a graph, or even a photograph, whatever way we choose to present that, it must represent accurately what we're trying to express and what we're trying to get across through our research and through our dissertation itself. Now, just give me a moment. I will put the slides up and we'll get started on the topic. As I said, I think tonight's going to be about an hour and a half, maybe a bit longer. So I kind of want to apologize in advance if it feels long. But I've changed this presentation based on previous runs that I've done for universities. So I sort of wanted to take something special. Anyhow, tonight is about visualizing research data and concepts. And data is one thing because that's, the numerics that we get. It's the quantification of qualitative information that we might have got through in vivo and all of that. But also research concepts is about frameworks. It is about models that we use, and perhaps that we've built ourselves, a model to try and explain how a phenomenon exists or how a phenomenon evolves. So it's not only about presenting quantitative data, quantitative as in numerical, but it's also about graphically presenting ideas and how we go about that. And as I said, I'm not going to teach you how to use software to do that. I'm not going to talk to you about the different types of designs and the different types of charts, but I'm going to talk about how we think through what is going to be the absolute best way that we can present visual ideas and data in our dissertation so that we get what we need to graduate. Objectives for tonight are pretty simple: to understand what data visualization is in the context of our PhD dissertation, to appreciate the different forms of data visualization that we can engage with, to appreciate considerations in selecting various visualization formats, to understand issues that impact our choice of visualization approaches. So, why do we choose a certain one over something else? to understand the grammar of graphics. Now, this is something that's really cool, and I've got a couple of articles I'll share through social media as well. But it's really about understanding the frameworks, not how we do them, but really what is at the base of every graphic image that we use from a design perspective, from a logic perspective, as well as from a communications perspective. And finally, to appreciate some best practice in presenting and explaining visual communication products. So I'm going to start off tonight. Some of the presentation that I'm giving, I've borrowed from elsewhere. And I'm going to share the link of where that came from, because there's some absolutely fantastic resources on this particular website that relate to data visualization for PhD candidates effectively. And it goes a lot deeper than what I'm going to talk about tonight, but it'll give you a chance that it's something that I've said and you want to learn a little bit more, or something I've said and you're like, I want to do it a bit differently, then you'll be able to take advantage of that and get more depth information as well. So what is data visualization? To me, I think it's a very big term. Data visualization is how we represent information or data in a visual context. What I like is the little diagram that's below, and it talks about the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. And there's 4 components there. The representation. What does it, what are we actually, or what data are we using, and how are we showcasing that to someone else? The presentation is the format that we use to showcase, and whether that format communicates in a way that's particularly clear. The data itself, we know that. Now, that can be qualitative or quantitative data. Typically, we will have quantitative data. But if we're using qualitative data, we may be using techniques or software to be able to group that up, to code it, to group it up, to be able to use it in a form of presentation. So, many of us will be familiar with NVivo as a software for taking narrative and being able to somehow, some form, quantify qualitative data in a way. And we might be just doing something as simple as word charts, or it may be a lot more complex than that. But we've got to look at the fact that it's both qualitative and quantitative, and that helps us. And finally, to facilitate understanding, which is really our key job as researchers, whether we are a PhD candidate, a master's candidate, a tenured professor who's 20 years older than I am and nearing retirement. Our job, our singular job, is not about the research itself. Our singular job is communicating that research to others so that they can understand. And whatever visuals we create, we use today, has got to be able to be understood by others, readers, other researchers, etc., so that it makes sense to them. Not only it's about our research, but it's something that they can understand. And that's really what data visualization is. So it's representation, presentation, data, and finally the all-encompassing one, understanding. And that's really where I want to get us to this evening more than anything else. So here's a few examples. And, as I said, I've just taken these off different presentations that are around. And they don't have any purpose for me tonight other than showcasing that there are different data visualization forms, different ways that we can express information and put that across. And we'll come back to that shortly. Why then is data visualization so important? And why am I, spending a couple of hours tonight doing a webinar specifically on this rather than, say, a writing webinar or one of the other topics? And it really comes down to a few key things. It is about narrative development. And narrative development is, to put it simply, the writing in your dissertation. And I think it's important for us to look at this because as we're writing, as we're explaining using text, our findings, our understanding, our interpretation, our analysis of everything we've found. Narrative development works hand in hand with visualization, about the imagery that we use, because the images help to support, they help to function as like case studies or vignettes of key things that we've got. They also help us to put together a lot of information and explain it so that we've got two ways, not only the visual, but also it's backed up by the very text that we use and that's expressed there. We look for clarity. I mean, I should have used the word transparency here as well, because it really is clarity and transparency in this respect. And this is simply about, look, I've got some data, I'm making some findings, I'm sharing those. Let me show you the data that I've got and show you how I came to some of these conclusions, or show you what I'm working with as a researcher, so that you can tell me, do you come to the same conclusions as well? It is about connection, and connection in two ways. I'm going to start off with connection as in joining the dots, because, you know, a lot of our research is about going from somewhere, iterating that, joining the dot with it and saying why something moved forward. And, you know, visualization in any form is going to help us to do that. But it's also about connection with the audience. So, you know, before I talked about the understanding, and connection relates to understanding that you are in a position that you can express and show so that somebody else can pick it up. Now, for me, I'm a visual learner. That means I love to look at visual diagrams. I love to look at tables, and I understand them really fast. I hate reading. So as a visual learner, I connect to what you write through the visual data, the visual product that you create. Data visualization is important for accuracy. We want to be able to showcase the accuracy at which we are working, the accuracy at which we are trying to extrapolate an understanding and analysis from that. It is about explanation in detail, so that kind of links back to transparency and clarity, but it is how much we can explain, to what detail level we're going to explain, so that others can further and springboard from that research. And it's also about extrapolation. Extrapolation is about how other researchers or ourselves, as we progress with our research journey in our career, how we take from the data that we've got and how we continue to build. Now, this can be both, you know, the quantitative data and what we do with its analysis, but it can also be that theory and model building that we're using or engaging with as well at the same time. Now, I wanted to give some practical advice, and this practical advice comes from actually a couple of academics that I follow online. Yeah, we kind of follow each other in the sense to find, you know, different ways of thinking about things. But I particularly liked this set of advice, and I wanted to share it with you now because I believe that everything we do with our dissertation is a strategy. It is about how we plan today to make sure that not only the PhD dissertation itself is presented and defendable, but it's also about everything else we are going to do with that presentation further down the track. So I wanted to give this as, you know, some piece of advice to get us to think about why it's so important to think through how we're best going to represent our different types of data in our dissertation. So only include visual communication products, that's what I call them, diagrams, maps, tables, other images that are necessary for your argument. The reason here is, look, the dissertation is meant to be tight. what you're putting in your dissertation is everything you need to explain your findings and your analysis. Don't add in graphics, visual communication products. Don't add these in to pad out a thesis. This is not an undergraduate essay. You know, I think those of you who teach at university, I know there's several, you will know that undergrads love to throw in diagrams and they really don't have that much relevance. So only create what is really going to value add to the narrative and to the overall dissertation that you've got. I think the absolute key piece of advice here is you will end up reusing visual products. The graphs, the diagrams, the figures, the photographs, everything that you use in your dissertation, you are going to end up reusing for several years down the track. That's because you're going to publish based on this, but you're also going to use it as the base of some other works, sorry. In respect of that, you know, because you're going to end up reusing them, and you might reuse them for a decade or even longer, because you're going to end up reusing them, some advice: do the best job you can the first time around. So really invest your time in creating an image, a visual communication product that is going to last a period of time. It gets easier to develop visuals as you grow as an academic. You know, there's a framework, there's a strategy, you're going to figure it out. When I think back to my early days and what I might do, I might do tomorrow if I'm in a good mood, is put up one of the very first models I ever developed. And I'll give you an example. I actually created this model on the fly at a conference presentation because I wanted to showcase how something evolved. But it became something that got used in multiple publications by 3 of us for several years after that. It got easier as time progresses to be able to think, how do you structure something? How do you build it? How do you create it? And from that, you know, I appreciate that experience helps. So don't worry about the fact that it's going to take you a bit of time to start with, because as you progress, things are going to get a lot better. Minimize waste. And, you know, this is not like ecologically friendly, but it kind of is in a way. It's mentally friendly. Generate the data, the model, the codes, the figures that will generate value for you in the future. And that value is going to be what can you use in conference presentations, what can you use in subsequent publications, what can you use in lectures, as opposed to something that's going to be a one-time gig that is not going to see the light of day outside of your dissertation. So you really want to make sure that you're thinking strategically about what goes in to the dissertation from a visual perspective, but also that you're thinking strategically about how it's going to be used. So I'm going to argue, look, visual communication products are effectively an investment. They take you time. One of the investments I might say is, look, I'm terrible at design. I'm absolutely shocking at trying to get something expressed. It may also be a financial investment in the sense that I would pay a designer, a graphic designer, somebody who not only understands design software, but can translate what I'm trying to do into or in a way that is actually most appropriate for your dissertation and other uses. So it can also be an investment financially in terms of hiring someone to help you create the images that are most appropriate. For me, it's simply about strategizing accordingly anyway. I want to talk for a moment about copyright and permissions because we have to be aware of it. Now, if you've come to my copyright and your thesis sessions, or you can check those out on our YouTube channel, which I'm sure Farrell will put in the chat box. You know, understanding copyright when we are utilizing somebody else's imagery. is very important. So making sure that we reference original sources for materials that we didn't create ourselves, ensuring that permissions are sought, not permission, but permissions are sought and obtained, and you keep a record that the owner of the copyright has given you permission to reproduce the work in your dissertation and anything subsequently that you're doing. So make sure that permissions are sought and obtained and kept on file in case, you know, somebody asks you. If you're using images sourced from outside your own data generation. The problem here is, look, future publication of your research can be limited by the use of cited materials, including images, if you don't have the appropriate copyright permission. So it's sort of a fine line to balance around and make sure that we're able to adhere to. Let's move into something a little bit more visual, a little bit more fun, the different data visualizations that we've got. And it comes down, I put them into 5 categories. Technically 7, which actually makes it 10, but you'll understand in a minute. So I look at tables, graphs, diagrams and or figures, kind of an interchangeable term, maps and photographs as being the key ones. But we'll see a couple of extras like the word box or the word diagram that sort of looks at the frequency of words and so forth, which is in some way a graph. Our different data visualizations can either be static or dynamic. So often when we do static, they're very easy to deal with because you're just looking at a few phenomena that you're comparing, that you're doing something with. Dynamic is a comparison. It's looking at what happens over a period of time and how things have changed over a period of time. And you can take a table and you compare a few years together and you can look at columns and columns of numbers. The problem is if you don't instantly see what's happening, that table of data isn't engaging with your reader or your audience. So the understanding might not be there. You might do it as a graph showing changes over time. You might do it as a map showing how a particular phenomenon geographically has evolved over a period of time as well. And so we've got to make sure that we're choosing the appropriate one for the appropriate time. It's important to recognize that, look, if we're looking at static versus dynamic, so we're looking at, say, for example, dynamic, as we're collecting the data, as we're looking at how we're going to collect the data, the bigger question should also be, as I'm thinking about the data to collect, how am I going to go about presenting that data as well? It's not just about designing yourself a survey and getting some useful data. At that stage, you should also be thinking about how am I best going to be able to present this data in a form that I can use in a dissertation. And sometimes if you look and you say, well, I've got this type of questionnaire and I'm going to be able to demonstrate it a certain way, you might look at the way that you think you can demonstrate and say, you know what, that's really not going to make the grade for me. It's not going to give me enough of punch. It's not going to give me enough of impact. And you might want to start looking at the best way to present the data as this format. And then you work backwards. You say, well, how do I get the data needed to actually present it in that particular format? And I feel that's a very important thing. We often think of visualization, i.e. the graphs, the tables, etc. We think that as an afterthought from the data that we're collecting. But it really should be one of the very first things we think about as we work through the best way to generate the data that we're going to do, or we work through the limitations of the data. Now I'm just going to put up, excuse me, mosquito, I'm just going to put up a few samples. So, you know, I talked about tables. Tables can be really helpful, but you can also be very bogged down with a table presented in a dissertation. Sometimes tables are best relegated to an appendix, where you might put tables and tables of data that are useful, i.e. so that you can showcase what you've done, how you've gone about it, blah, blah, blah. But they're not going to necessarily be the best way to visually communicate inside the dissertation itself. We have graphs, and we are by no means restricted to these 6 type of very simple graphs. But when you look online, and when I share some of the resources through social media later, you'll see the huge array or the huge selection opportunity for different graphs that there are. And you've got to be able to think what's going to work the best. You've also got to be able to think, and this comes back to what actually do I want to show? And by understanding what I want to be able to show in the process, I'm also thinking about what type of charts, what type of graphs are going to be useful. So if I'm wanting to show a comparison, bottom right of this particular diagram, bottom right shows me, look, is it over time? Is it multiple items? So what comparison am I trying to show? And then it's giving a suggestion as to where I'm heading with the visual output that needs to be created. Likewise, if I'm showing relationships, so top left of this particular image, if I'm showing a relationship, what sort of graphs are going to be best for me to be able to explore that with. Diagrams and figures, you'll probably see if you came to my literature mapping webinar. I've just stolen that from there. But diagram and a figure is how you present relationships between ideas. So this is the research concepts rather than the data itself, but building a model, building a framework, and visually presenting relationships between ideas or processes and happenings, and how we want to do that. And the considerations here become not only how do I spatially structure this over, over my page, but it's also how do I use shading, how do I use lines, how do I use visual elements to highlight most important through to least important processes and so forth. Maps, a huge number of different types of maps. And again, the resources I'm going to share will go a lot deeper into maps. Now, for many of us, we're probably not trained in cartography, we're probably not trained in geographic information systems, and creating maps can be really painful. This is where engaging help or services of a GIS specialist, for example, we may want to create certain types of maps. And a map isn't always traditionally what we see here, a cartographic map, by the way. But we may want to create a certain type of map that really helps us to express particular data. It's a good time to be able to say, look, I know what I want to create. Talk to a GIS specialist, approach us if you need, but talk to a GIS specialist. What can I do? I know I'm going to collect this type of data. I know I want to present it in a map form. How do you recommend I can do that? And again, it's working backwards. If you've got an idea from somebody as what you can do visually, then you can come back and work out actually what data do you need to collect to make that happen. Many maps like this are not difficult to access. It's what we choose to do with them that will take our time and our investment. Now we have photographs, and I purposely chose this photograph, not because I know the person, I have absolutely no idea who they are, but to be able to look at the fact that, look, the same photograph can be presented in a couple of different ways. So in this case, black and white and color. And one of the things we have to be able to consider as PhD researchers printing a black and white dissertation that's going to be scanned or microfiched or whatever electronically scanned is to what extent do we want to use color. I also chose this photograph for another purpose. The original photograph is actually the black and white photograph, and it was colored using colorization techniques to try and make it look more authentic. That's image manipulation, and that's an issue, a copyright issue, effectively, or one of the ethics issues that we have to consider. If we're colorizing something, to what extent do we distort its reality as a result of doing that? And I just sort of wanted to get that message across very quickly right now, because if we're utilizing a black and white image and then we do something about colorization, we're actually distorting the narrative. And likewise, if we take a color image and we put it into a black and white format, we're distorting the narrative again. When we're out in the field, when we're taking photographs, and for some of us, we will be up there. Maybe we're doing observational research. We're recording, certain aspects. We're taking photographs of the processes, or we're selecting certain photographs that we want to be able to include. We've got to spend as much time in strategizing how that photograph is going to be and how we're going to use it. So all of these things have to come into it, how the level of detail that we can get, whether or not we're going to be doing it into a black and white system, whether we're going to be using color, how that color is going to reproduce, how do we scale down the photograph, how do we hone in on certain parts of the photograph, and so forth. So there's a lot of considerations that we have to make in that process. That in itself brings us to something else that I think is an important consideration, and why I'm going to spend a few minutes on that now. And that's data visualization is simply not neutral. And what I mean by that is, look, we often want to take a graphic, whether it be a table, a map, a graph, whatever. We want to take it at face value. But just like everything we do, there could potentially be an inherent bias or non-neutrality in that particular image. And we've got to be aware of that. So visualization is the result, visualization is a result of numerous choices involving a range of people, those who want the visualization to be made, those making it, and others in between. And what I mean by that is, look, as researchers, either we're doing it all ourselves, we're getting some assistance, perfectly fine, but every contributor to the visualization or the visual product is adding a layer of complexity that may, in fact, distort or create or unintentionally put a bias into how it's presented. And we all have that. And I'll use maps as an example. So I'm interested in cartography. I'm interested in historic maps. And one of the very first, one of the oldest maps that I have a copy of, I don't have the original, but one of the oldest maps I have is a map of China. And in this map of China, before they realized the world was a globe and they thought it was flat, China is viewed as the center of the world. And the Chinese name for China is Middle Kingdom. And they literally had themselves in the middle with the rest of the world out. Now that's a perspective. The map itself wasn't necessarily inaccurate at the particular time, but it was the perspective on what they had. It was a layer of bias that they put on. Now, when we do maps of the world, China is in a particular place, but it depends on the viewpoint of the map, how you will see China. The actual land area of China can, on some maps, appear significantly larger than on others, simply because of how the curvature of the world has been accounted for and the distortions accounted for in that respect. Now, that's just one example, okay? It relates across all forms of visual approach. If I'm doing a table, as a researcher, I might consider A, B, and C to be far more important than X, Y, and Z. And the way in which I treat A, B, and C in my rows and my columns may somewhat be a little bit different to how I treat X, Y, and Z because of the importance I put on it, rather than the understanding I should be communicating or helping you obtain from that particular process. So when we say data visualization is not neutral, I'm simply talking about the fact that every time we make a choice of how to create a visual communication product, okay, a graph, a map, a table, or whatever, every time we make a choice on that, we're making some assumptions. We're showcasing potential or unintentional, I should say, but potential biases and so forth. And that's something that we have to be cognizant of when we are thinking through the best way to present our data. Our responsibility as a researcher is to present objective data in a way that others can relate to. So we've got to try and peel back as many biases. We peel back easy with our words, but we have to peel back from our visuals as well. So a few facts. Look, designers, us, not only, graphic designers, but researchers, us, make decisions. So that's a decision about what data to use in the first place. So we're already putting forward some certain things about what to do, what to include, what to exclude. What are we taking out of the data set? What are we taking out of our analysis? Or what are we saying is so unimportant that we shouldn't put it in a figure or a diagram? Those are choices we make. And the third choice we make is also about how to narrate what we are visualizing. And the how to narrate what we are visualizing is about I almost want to say politics, but the strength of meaning, maybe the politics of meaning, but the strength of meaning about the words we are using to link our research, to explain our research, to explain our findings, and then link it to the image that we are using then as well. Now, if that's not enough, because, that's irritating in the sense that we make decisions that create biases, right? It's also the people, the them, us versus them, the readers, our supervisor, our examining body, the three people other than our parents who read our dissertation, often interpret data visualization as appearing normal. And in respect of that, they put a different lens onto what is being expressed as well. And this is particularly in comparison with narrative. A picture says 1,000 words. It's easier to look. As I said, I'm a visual learner. I get to see it, right? So I'll look at the graph first before I bother about the text. And if the graph already has, or the visual, sorry, if the visual already has some unique strengths or biases to it, by default, I've interpreted those biases, but I've considered it to be neutral, even though you as the researcher have actually skewed it in a particular way. So we've got to find a way that our decisions mean that a reader is going to interpret our visualization in a neutral way with as few or zero if possible, but as few biases as possible from the process. So I'm going to ask a question. I put this in here. It's a graphic I use every so often on social media. Would your thesis defend you? And I kind of want to relate it back to what I've just talked about. Our job is to defend our thesis, but at the end of the day, we've got to be able to say, does the product, the thesis itself, defend the choices that we made? Does it represent reality, objective reality, as best as it possibly could? So I ask you one question, and that's really what I've got over the left. In your Viva, when you come to present your dissertation, present your research, and I'm sitting there in the panel, or somebody much worse than me, because I think I'm a nice guy. In your Viva, would you be prepared to justify your data visualization decisions? And that means if I sat with you and I asked you, process questions about your choice of every imagery, every data, every visualization, every image you use. Could you defend those? Could you justify why you did them a certain way? And I put it there because you might be asked to explain this, okay? Maybe not, maybe yes. But at the end of the day, to be an ethically sound researcher, you should be able to say, yeah, I can justify every choice. And that's about, coming back to this, it's about picking out or acknowledging the biases and finding ways that we can limit them or reduce them in some way. Now, I wanted to go into, again, staying on the fact that, there are bias here, how we create an aura of objectivity. And this is really about, look, nothing's ever perfectly objective. I think we can be realistic about that fact, right? But how do we go about presenting things in a way that try to make any visual element of our dissertation as objective as it possibly can? And it comes down to four things: two-dimensional viewpoints, clean layouts, geometric shapes and lines, and the inclusion of data sources. Now, I'm going to go through each of those really briefly. The resources that I'm going to put up in the coming few days are going to go into this in more detail, and it's something that you can spend a bit of time looking at. Two-dimensional viewpoints is, look, you make the map or you make whatever image that you're creating as clean as possible. You don't want the person thinking so much about how or what it means. You want it to be very easy to read. You want it to be as clear and concise as you can from the first point. When we come into this, so let's go back, two-dimensional, this is the typical map that we understand. This is a typical map that we're used to reading or seeing because it's kind of closer to what we think reality is. When we get into something like this, our interpretation, our creativity with visual presentation actually change how we see things. And if you have a look, the constituency view, for example, I'm going to really struggle with understanding that map because everything now becomes a hexagon, which is equal sizes. And suddenly that doesn't represent the uneven geographical sizes that are on this map. So I'm going to have to think about, how do I want to understand this? How do I want to interpret this? The map on the right showing population view, and again, the resources I'm going to share have an entire set on this particular style of map. It's very difficult for the reader to interpret. It looks great if you're writing a textbook that you are going to use with, students. But in presenting objective research, it comes across that you're trying to be, I want to say fancy, but you're trying to present more than you need to. You're also not making the job of the reader as easy as possible. You want to look at clean layouts, and clean layouts are simply about putting any imagery onto your page in a way that is very easy to see, very easy to understand, very easy to note the differences. So if you look at the top line here, when I was looking at this the other day, I thought all the circles were equal. Now, when I look at it tonight, because I'm focused on it in a lot more intensity than I was the other day, all the circles are a different size. So we want to see, we want to make sure that it's very clean and clear and easy to digest. We want to look at geometric shapes and lines, and this is a tool that I love. There's actually a software developer that from the States that I was talking to a couple of years ago that were creating, based on Zoom communications, by the way, that were creating graphics like this that represented share of communication through a Zoom meeting, or you can apply it to education, you can apply it to business, any number of things. at the end of the day, not only do we have the combination of color, we have the lines, we have the dynamic of that. It may or may not make the job easier for the reader. So it's thinking about the shapes, the lines, what the thicknesses mean, all this sort of stuff. But it's about, if I give you this with no text, no narrative whatsoever, how long will it take you, or how easy will it be for you to look at that and say, I know exactly what this is talking about? And the final one to be sort of, at least try to be objective, to think about is, the inclusion of data sources. So it's about having that impression of openness and transparency. So the sources of the data, not only your own, but any others that you're engaging with, are cited on the graph. The identification of the methods to obtain that data. Anything that's going to help clarify and give a narrative context to the graph will help. The more you put into your visual that helps to explain without being wordy, but helps to make sure that the key signposts are there, that's going to be useful for you. So what happens when data visualization goes wrong? So I put up a couple on LinkedIn earlier today. I love the one about all the humans on Earth rolling into a ball of goo, and being smaller than Central Park in New York. And I looked at it, and I actually picked this up offline a while ago, and there are comments, this can't be right, surely. But when you think about it, we're tiny, tiny, tiny. When we're all squashed together, we actually don't take up a lot of space. The problem is that is not the way to represent human population, because it's really hard for us to relate to the visual that is there. Now I'm going to put up a few examples of really bad graphics, and they're bad for two reasons. One, I'm not really comfortable with their color and background. That's a separate thing. But two, they don't necessarily put across an easy to understand meaning. And I'm putting these up today in this to be able to show to you, look, some things that look great, because they do look great, or some of them look great, don't necessarily convey the message that you need. These are more journalistic than they are research, except they actually came out of research projects, which is the disturbing part. So as we develop images and infographics and so forth, we've still got to make sure that they make sense to everybody. So I want to start this off by saying, look, it boils down to your own research. Images are only as good as the data they display. And this is why I say, look, you want to understand the type of graphic that you can create, the type of imagery that you can create, work backwards, and then design your data collection to make sure that it generates that type of data for you. If you can do that, wow, you're spot on, absolutely brilliant. But if you don't, you might not be getting enough data to present it in a way that you are comfortable with. So here's a few examples. I'm not going to really talk about them. I think, have a bit of a look. I find the first one, the federal subsidies, very challenging to read. On the right-hand side, we have 29 billion worth of renewable energy. And on the left-hand side, in exactly the same space, exactly the same size, we have 72.5 billion. So really, my maths is pretty shit, but I think 2.5 times the right-hand side. So it's a terrible visualization because it doesn't accurately reflect proportions. Visually, it's nice, but what it's not doing is giving you an honest picture. It's distorting how you might go about interpreting. If we look on the right, where your food comes from, not even going to go with some of that. it took me a while to figure out where the food is actually coming from, because I see things, aren't clearly out there. I'm also wondering how they got 88% of that fillet of fish. Did they measure the entire thing and then cut it judiciously and the exact 88%? Because I don't think so. Again, it comes across as distorted when I think about it critically. It's a great visual. If I'm putting it in a newspaper, that could be really fine and not so much of an issue. But it's still going to impact the way in which I want to view it and the robustness that I think it is when I view it. And I look at that, I'm like, maybe. This one's brilliant. I love the McDonald's. And it should be that the logos are representing values that are on the right-hand side. But when I look at McDonald's, I wonder if they had a dip in their revenues or something like that. I'm also very confused as to why the GDP of Afghanistan came in there. Again, they're trying to present something in a visually appealing way, but it's not necessarily in the most visually clear or explanatory, clear way of doing that. This one's great. A weekly poll. Would you pay more for your milk to help dairy farmers? 87% of people said yes, and 13% said no. But according to the graph, those 13% are actually half of the people who are there anyway. The best one is the number of murders committed in Florida using guns. And it actually looks like the number of murders declined. Because if you look at the trend in the 2000s, and especially the trend in the 2010s, it looks like it's declined, but they flipped the axis. They flipped the vertical axis. If you flip this graph upside down, the number of murders increased. And in fact, the number of murders have increased for relatively a decent amount of time. And all it is manipulating the way in which data is presented, so that you see something that aligns to a particular political narrative, for example, in this case, right, which relates to stand your ground law. It looks like as soon as stand your ground law was introduced, the number of murders were reduced. Reality was actually the number of murders increased on average as a result of that, and we're not really performing significantly better than we were before the law. How we present, and it can be as simple as flipping that axis, how we present data actually is going to showcase. We are trained as everyday observers, not even as researchers. Everyday people are trained to read graphs in a certain way. And when you flip something, we still are trained to read it a certain way, so we don't take notice of those things. But this is a distortion. This is a bad presentation of the research. I wanted to show those just to give some ideas. And in a way, you're going to have to go back to your own stuff. You're going to have to look at it. You share it with others and say, you know what, how do you see what I'm presenting graphically for you? Is it something that really gets the message across easily? Is it something that gets an objective message across? Or are you sort of taken down a slightly different narrative? I want to move into design principles and practicality. And this is really just a few basics to think about. And one of the decisions is, look, am I using a visual, so maybe a table of data? Am I using a figure, which might be a graph or a diagram? Or am I best to use text? Simple data does not need graphics. Let's go back to this, the yes and no. If you put a correct pie chart like this in your dissertation and you submitted it to me, I will be challenging you on that because it's a sentence. You don't need a pie chart like that to explain that 87% of British consumers are willing to pay more for their milk to help dairy farmers. I don't need a graph to explain that. Any visual should be about explaining something more complex or highlighting trends or highlighting key data that comes out of it. So you've got to be able to decide, look, is there enough data in here that deserves a visual representation of it? Or does it deserve a narrative representation, i.e. a sentence, a paragraph, or a section? So it's good to be able to think about when to use text versus a visual. And then in visuals, are we using a figure? Are we using a table? Are we using a map? Is a photograph going to help? All of those. And, it's kind of a bit challenging for me because I talk about the 5 different categories of visuals, right? And they're all valid, but they're all used at different times. Some can be used interchangeably, some certainly cannot be. But you've got to be able to think, at what stage, when is it going to be most appropriate, and what type of visual is going to be most appropriate then. There are 4 frustrations that good figures avoid. And I know this is just, I realize it now, I'm framed it so much in the negative. But let's look at this. If you create strong image, it's actually going to help a lot because you're avoiding some of the frustrations for your readers. That will be on a practical level, us as assessors, our concerns about improper image manipulation. So everything I've showed you before, all the negatives I've talked about, all the biases, everything like that, I want to get a sense from your dissertation that you have not manipulated the presentation of data in any way to, I guess, follow a particular bias. I want to see that, look, you're trying to be objective, you're presenting everything and making decisions based on that. You're not hiding something from me, you're not over or underemphasizing something from me through any form of visual manipulation. Now, in a photograph, for example, that may be cropping out an element of a photograph to be able to be used in a certain way. So there's a famous photograph that I'm aware of. I don't have it with me here to share with you, but let me explain it to you. There's a photograph that went into some global news many years ago, and it was about this child running from American soldiers in fear. And it was quite a powerful image because you have this young kid who's probably 7 or 8, maybe, younger or older. I'm not very good with kids. But you've got this youngish looking kid who's running from American soldiers as if they are going to eat him. The full photo, which was published elsewhere, was actually a group of American soldiers, a group of local kids playing baseball, or one of those sports. I'm not very good with sports either, obviously. And the child was running to the base before the ball could get at him. The expression was wanting to win and get there and trying to do it, but the media had cropped that particular image to make it look like the kid was fearful of the soldiers, when in fact it was a completely different situation. Now, that's image manipulation, and we can all do that. We can distort any photograph we want to try and evoke feelings or to represent something that is different to what the original intended purpose of that photograph was. So we care about image manipulation. You need to be able to show to us that, look, you've actually created this image, this visual content, this visual product. You've created it in a way that works, that doesn't misrepresent or unduly show bias. We want to avoid that assessors and readers don't understand the point of your figures. If you're creating a visual and I can't understand it relatively fast, you'll fail. because your job as a researcher is not only to do the research, but to communicate that research to a variety of audiences and communicate it in a way they could understand. So the understanding, and if you remember that very first slide I had, understanding was the last one, the last of the 4 key points. You've got to make sure it's understanding. You want to use it so that readers avoid losing interest in your paper. That's really important because it's kind of like a graphic hook. It's something for them to hook onto and see. And also it's time wasted in both assessment and review in the publication process. You don't want, especially if you're going to publish what you're doing, you don't want a journal coming back to you and say, redesign this. It looks terrible. Or, we can't print it as it is. Recreate how it is. So let's go on to some design principles so I can sort of wrap up where we're heading tonight. The principles are really easy. Clarity is always key. You want to make it as clean and clear as you possibly can. You want to design for print, not just screen. A lot of what we do, we design to look great on screen, but we need to design it in such a way that it will print out. When your dissertation is in a PDF format or it has been scanned, as many will be, that it's easy to reprint. It's easy for others to use and so forth. We want to avoid JPEGs except for photos. So we want to make sure that we're using imagery that is not fixed as a 2-dimensional locked object. We want to be able to adjust sizing and so forth so that it fits into the space that we've got. And we also want to make sure that across the dissertation, there is a synergy, a consistency with every graphic that we use. We want to avoid converting images between formats. That's something that's really important. I'm pretty bad at that because I do tend to interchange sometimes, but this becomes a consideration that we have to make. We want to make sure the text is legible when printed. When I go and I create an image such as this, it looks lovely. And I would love to put that in a book that I write or something like that. But at the end of the day, the text that is on that image is actually at a point that it is very challenging for me to read. Our job is about clear communication. It's got to look nice, but at the end of the day, this doesn't help express the ideas or put across the information that is there. We want to avoid fancy backgrounds. So that includes color blocks. We should always look where we can towards a white background. Again, that's for scanning, photocopying, reproducibility, but it's also clarity of understanding. I am very much in favor of the more simplistic approach. Maybe that's because I don't like the technology that I use to create some of this. But at the end of the day, you want to draw attention to the point that your image is making, not to the design of the image, but you want to draw attention to the key message that your image is creating. So be cautious of that. And finally, color versus black and white. If this is a textbook, if this is a lecture, if this is even a conference presentation, color's great. One of the considerations we have to make is in a PhD dissertation, is color appropriate or should it be maintained as black and white? Most PhD dissertations that get scanned are probably scanned in black and white, so there'll be distortion. I can't answer the color versus black and white. My personal intuition says, look, black and white, clean and clear. But that's going to pose problems. You have to look at understanding what your university policy is. Does the university dictate to you that color is not approved? Do they encourage you to use color? Do they encourage you not to use color? Either way, you have to follow that, but it's important for you to think about that. if we're going to do photographs, we want to set ourselves up right. And that's really about mastering our technique, capturing the right image, capturing lots and lots of images. You don't take one image and say, yes, I've got it. You take 200 images and then you spend an hour afterwards figuring out which of those 200 images, which is the perfect one that I can use. It's really some simple advice here, nothing mind-shatteringly unusual. Save figures at high resolution, make sure they're in the right format. Remember earlier I said, look, every visual content you create, every visual communication content you create is something that you are potentially going to reproduce and use multiple times. So make sure you've got it not only for your dissertation, but you've got it in what is required. So journals require a particular resolution for their photographs and so forth. Just make sure you're getting it, you're meeting those needs, and make sure you keep all the original files. When you create, look at your university guidelines, think about the journal guidelines that you're using as well. So here's where our publication strategy comes into play. It's not only about what do I need to make or to make sure that my PhD dissertation is there, is I know I want to get 4 publications from these journals. Actually, what are their guidelines as well? Because you're going to want to not recreate all of your visuals every time. You're going to look at making sure that, or doing your best to make sure that you can meet everybody's guideline in a single visual output. So some of the considerations become the width. Does it go over a page? Does it, how does it fit? Do you have it portrait? Do you have it landscape? If it's a multi-page image, so that might be a table that goes on for 3 or 4 pages. How do you present that? In what format? How do you create the table breaks? All of that. You want to think about the file type that you are using. So how are you saving it? How is it going to be accessed? That depends on the software you're using to output your dissertation as well. If there's color allowed, if there is it RGB or is it CYMK? Can't really explain that. I had one of my staff explain that to me a few years ago, and in the end, I still like, too much stress, you can do it for me. But knowing the color coordinates, I guess, knowing the formats of the colors is going to help you make sure you're setting it up correctly rather than have to redo it. Font size and type, so the scalability, the reproducibility, the fact that you can adjust the font, so maybe Arial to Times New Roman, not that anybody should ever go to Times New Roman, but assuming that it doesn't distort the table, it doesn't change the visuality of the table or the diagram that you've got. The line weight, if you're doing a figure, a diagram, say, for example, you're putting in an arrow, does the weight of the arrow suggest something more than its relative role in the respective components of that particular diagram? So all of these are things that we have to think about on the ground as we're doing it. I want to spend a moment talking about grammar of graphics, and I'm not going to go in detail, but I'm going to share a couple of articles and a link to a book. The grammar of graphics is really an interesting, complex idea, but it simply comes down to, look, every language has grammar. We know the rules of grammar. We make a sentence a certain way, it means a certain thing. There's a grammar to graphics, to visuals as well. And we present visuals in a certain way. So if you think about, let's go back to this one, Florida, and Stand Your Ground law. We would typically have that flipped on the vertical axis, because we'd start at the bottom with 0 and the top with 1,000. And that would represent our understanding of how numerics work and how graphs are. Now, that's a grammar of graphics issue in any way. It's simply about what we understand the right way. About what we understand the right way of a graphic, an image to be, and how it's constructed and what that means. So grammar is the basic element of an area of skill or knowledge. It's like when driving a car. We turn the car on first, we put it into first gear or drive, depending on what we take the handbrake off and then we drive. We don't put it into first gear and then turn the key on because we know that's wrong. That's grammar of driving. So there is grammar of graphics. The book that's here, and I don't really want to talk about the text that's on here, right? But it is a framework for thinking about graphics. The book that's here actually has some elements in it in terms of what we have to think about from a design perspective. And I'm going to share the book link. I'm going to share another article. To me, it's very complicated in the sense that there's a lot more detail in there than I need to know as a researcher today. But if you want to understand or have a deeper understanding of how imagery should be created and understood from the audience, then maybe take a look at this. I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. I'm going to roughly go through some very general guidelines. And I'm putting them here. One, your university will tell you most of this. So have a look. I'm just putting them here to wrap up. But I'll wrap up in a few minutes and go on to a Q&A session because my purpose is to get us thinking about what we have to think about for the images that we use. If we're doing figures and images, so dissertation text must include a reference to each figure before the actual figure. So this is about how we do our layout, where we place it within our text. They must be clearly laid out, appropriate size, should not include unnecessary empty space. So this is design as much as content and presentation. They need to fit into the margins. I had a table in my master's thesis that really went right to the edge of the page. And that's a no-no. Back then, master's thesis, you're kind of overlooked. It's not such a big thing. But a lot of people still make these mistakes. In order to fit everything in onto a page, they just chunk it and they'll change the margins for the page. You've got to really look at your principles of design. And if something's too big for a page, i.e. it's stretching those margins, it's not only about the design that you've got. It's about, is everything in that visual necessary for you? And if it is, okay, then you look at design. If it's not, what do I take out and how do I redesign it so it fits within consistent parameters of my document? Making sure each figure and image has a number in its series. Make sure that there's a list of figures, a list of images, etc. after the table of contents. If your caption runs into a second line, indent it so it starts from the same place. And possible references after the caption text. So, source, whether you've abridged it from something, whether you've aggregated two or more sources of data and added your own, and so forth. Small symbols can have large meanings. So I talked about the arrowhead, for example. It's about how we use visual connectors within our graphics, how we use even lines on a line graph, for example, the weight, the heaviness, the thickness of those. It's whether they present more than just the trend. Are they suggesting that something is more important than the other? And this is where color comes in. If we use bold versus soft colors, bold colors will always be considered the most important, but it may have been randomly chosen by Microsoft Excel, for example. So we've got to be very cautious about the symbols, the lines, any shape element that we use. When we create figures ourselves, this is when we design a diagram or a figure that is based on our own understanding, our own experience. We can actually display our capacity to understand relationships. And that's quite good. So tomorrow, as I said, I'll share with you one of the very first graphics I ever did. You can have a good laugh at it because it is pretty bad. But it did help people to understand the relationship. I screwed up though, because my choice of arrows and line weightings kind of deviated from what it should have been. If it's taken from something else, make sure there's a citation, but then you're merging, if you're adding on, if you're contributing a further development to somebody else's model or visual, making sure that the way in which you add on to that is sympathetic to it is going to be very important as well. And creating alternative text for figures, graphs, and diagrams can be challenging. So if the information is found in the text itself, you can refer to it in an alternative text. Sometimes we have to have notes, little, little footnotes to a diagram to be able to explain it. That's not the legend. That's actually trying to make a clarification of something. So we've got to be able to balance all of these things that come into it. Images, so photographs or screenshots, only used when needed. Again, we come into permissions here. We've got to make sure that we're not distorting photographs in any way. Tables, much the same level of advice. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this because I don't think it's needed at this stage. But a table is often too much data. The question you have to ask is, what data do I need right this minute to reinforce the narrative and to showcase the trend? Can I put a more comprehensive table in an appendix that the interested reader can then refer to the appendix to think through themselves? Because I'm not going to talk about it in my dissertation directly. So, what do you need for the purpose of your narrative? What do you need for the purpose of their further understanding and development? Again, more advice here. To what extent do I want to put things in? So I'm going to hand